This is also related to demography. Okay? So this part is important, interesting. And it's related to cognitive health. Okay, so I think it's interesting for everybody. So just a brief CV. So Matthias studied psychology in Vienna, in Mainz and Albuquerque. And then after getting the PhD in Heidelberg, and also, well, so you have also the habilitation in Zurich. He did some postdocs in Heidelberg, in the German Research Center on Aging, and then was assistant and associate professor of psychology in Zurich. And after that, he passed to Dresden, the University of Dresden, where he was a full professor, and now he's also full professor of psychology in the University of Geneva. I mean, he has several awards, and actually I was checking before a little the Scholar webpage, and it's impressive. Okay? So for me, I was going down and saying, how many papers does he have? And then say, 100 more, click. He was going, no. So I have no idea how many papers you have, but okay, so
stop counting.
To have you here, and
thank you very much. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for coming, even if the topic is a bit out of your usual working area. But welcome. I suppose perhaps to make it more, make it clearer why this may be relevant for all of you in the room. So I suppose you're physicists or psychologists. There are psychologists. There you go. Excellent. So I mean, what part of your biocomplexity do you need to do your work? I mean, so what would happen if you're losing your mental ability? What would happen if you're losing your cognitive ability? And I suppose that makes it clear that this is an area of human functioning where we are all concerned. And we study cognitive functioning from a psychological perspective, mostly using behavior, but also neuroscience methodology. I will focus on behavioral aspects today in the talk, but I'm happy to discuss any neuroscience-related work from us as well. In Geneva, and I'm basically presenting you work that's been conducted in the context of 3 different institutions that I'm affiliated with. So I'm the chair of cognitive aging at the psychology faculty in Geneva, but also the head of the director of the Center of Aging Research. So just to give you a bit of a context where I come from, and obviously almost all of the publications that you can find on the web is basically a product of those teams. So I'm just sitting in the background and pulling strings. So this is our research program from our Aging Research Center. There are 2 research areas. One is more aging related, and one is life course vulnerability, inequality related, where we look at healthy aging, digital aging, cognitive aging, vulnerable aging. And then in this life course, there are different populations that are vulnerable across the lifespan that we look at. And that's a center that's been funded with a center grant from the Swiss National Science Foundation, where we work with several groups in Switzerland in that area. And then that's my core team in the cognitive aging lab, where we look at, from an experimental perspective, on cognitive aging. We look at cognitive and clinical neuroscience of aging and applied aspects. I will try to give you a bit of an overview on these issues from a perspective that I hope may be informative for also some of your thinking. So the challenge that we are faced with is that cognitive aging starts early. So when I look at the people in this room, we're all into the zone of cognitive aging. So don't think cognitive aging is just simply something that concerns the elderly. We know that as of mid and 20s, our cognitive capacities decline. So this is something that we are all faced with. We know that there are different trajectories depending on domain. There are different trajectories depending on whether you look at cross-sectional or longitudinal data. There's a general pattern that a lot of the basic functions, like memory-related, processing speed, they decline relatively rapidly and linearly across the lifespan. There are other domains, more knowledge-related, they rest relatively stable. So that's why you're all here, building up your knowledge base to fight your cognitive decline. But that's something that's at the base of why we look at that in general, these are capacities under pressure as soon as we are adults. And when we look at one of the main driving forces of cognitive aging, processing speed, so the speed that we use to process information, incoming information, but also outgoing information. Just to take that as an example, we also know that behind those lines of average performance patterns across the lifespan, there's huge variability. So there are huge differences between participants, between individuals. So this is zooming into a data set from our own lab, looking at the range of older adulthood. And while you can see there's this typical age decline on average, you also see when you look at the individuals, there are huge differences. And the question for us is what drives those individual differences. So why do some people really drop dramatically and some people maintain a performance level that is relatively high? So that's one of our main research interests, to explain the mechanisms behind those huge differences between individuals. I have the feeling there's actually warm air coming out there, which is a bit bizarre. So this has also been looked at from a more population health or economic type of perspective, and cognitive resources, cognitive health, cognitive skills, so to speak, have become an interest in several domains. So this is a really nice Nature review paper where colleagues have looked at the mental capacity from a population perspective and have analyzed that in details, but I would just like to use that as an illustration that even in those domains, it's becoming more and more clear that cognitive health, cognitive resistance, cognitive coping skills, cognitive reserve, whatever people build up across their life to sustain cognitive abilities is becoming a topic in a number of areas. And I would like to present you 3 lessons that we learned in that type of research to kind of counter waste of mental capital that you can observe even in those analyses. So lesson number 1 is a bit the basis for motivating our research. Cognitive resources are vitally important for the aging individual and for an aging society. So why do research about cognition? A bit in the service of that initial question that I asked at the beginning, people have looked at the importance in different scenarios, and this is a study actually when I entered my PhD that really became a bit of a driving force in my own work, that Paul Lawton, a very important person that has died, unfortunately, in the meantime, has reported that when asking people what is their driving force in life, 2/3 of the older adults would not wish to live any longer under all forms of cognitive impairment. Obviously, that's debatable whether they would then still decide whether this is the case when they are in the situation, but it just illustrates that for us, being in cognitive health that's sufficient to maintain an active lifestyle is among the top priorities in health research in general, because you can much less easy compensate those losses instrumentally, technically at the moment, than in other domains. I mean, we're basically all wearing glasses. A lot of you probably wear other non-visible devices to compensate for these sensomotoric losses. This is much less easy in cognitive domains. So when we look at the individual priorities, we also looked, this is a survey that we did a few years ago, what would people do to maintain this cognitive health? So, and I can forward that question to you. So how much time would you invest daily if this would help you maintain your cognitive health for 1 more year? How many minutes, seconds, hours would you?
1 hour.
1 hour. That's less 1 hour work. Or in the.
Well, it depends on how it works, right?
Well, I promise you can postpone the onset of your cognitive impairment by 1 year.
No, more time, probably not 1 hour. It's 2 hours or so.
Okay, well, I mean, when we look at this, so you are actually very willing, but even if you have a little bit more time to reflect what that would mean in the daily organization of your work or private routine, a lot of people would be willing to invest some time. So again, demonstrating that this is something that people are concerned about and that they would be willing to change. And then for us as researchers, the question is, can we and how can we do that? And what are the means to do so? From a societal perspective, there are also different lines of research demonstrating that maintaining cognitive health in old age and across the life course in general is and should be a top priority. I mean, one aspect that has been studied tremendously, and I don't go into detail here, obviously, is all the research that is concerned with the societal costs, being economic or non-economic costs for neurodegenerative diseases, health-related issues with dementia, and so which is in the focus of a lot of this research of cognitive resources in this from a societal perspective. But also when you look at the younger old people, so without looking at somebody specifically, the older working force, so to speak. That's something that we have looked at. Cognitive resources are a major predictor for health and workability in the aging workforce. So this is something that we got concerned with when I was in Dresden, where obviously the demographic changes are also affecting the working population, and companies are more and more concerned with keeping the people as much as possible. And if the societal constraints change and people are forced to work until 70, and the question obviously then is for us as neuroscientists or cognitive psychologists, can they? What can they do? Can they work as efficiently, as healthy as possible in those years? And here we did some studies, and I'll just show you a brief highlight from that area, work psychology. We did look at that because we were a bit concerned, or we were surprised that in the classical literature about what drives the ability to work, people talk about a lot of things that are reasonable, like health or values and networks and society, but what about cognition? This does not play any role in psychological theories of work-related factors, especially for the aging population, or the let's say 45, 40 plus, so the second half of the work life. So we did a few studies in the field of nursing, as an example, where we interviewed and tested older workers, and just to give an idea how these studies look like. So we looked at them, we followed them up at several time points, and we assessed really extensively their skills, cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and assessed their health, the progression of health, and their workability. Testing this model, testing the idea that it's actually not age that determines whether a person is staying healthy at work. It's not the factor that people should look at. It's more how the resources, and especially also how the cognitive resources are developing. And it doesn't really matter whether the person is 20, 25, 30, 40, 50. It's not the factor that determines health and workability. These are those mediating factors. And here we showed in a number of studies that that's actually the case, and that you can predict workability and the age effect in workability by different cognitive factors that I could explain a bit more in detail if you want in the discussion. And that's true for both workability and health. So age per se can be explained away as a factor people should look at in organizational context or human resource management. And that's true for analysis that even controlling for most traditional factors like physical health or motivation or stuff like that. Okay, second lesson we learned that's related to this cloud of points that I showed you before. And that's something that I still find very fascinating, and it still drives a lot of our research, is that cognitive aging is individually very different. And when you put it in other words, many older adults are actually fitter than younger adults. It's not that when you become older, your cognitive system declines in the same way. And the driving forces for these differences are actually much more interesting than these general linear trends that is averaging across those different individuals. So I give you an example of a study that we did a while ago where we tested this for the domain of learning. And to, I mean, you all know, we're basically all involved with students. Learning is heavily dependent on previous knowledge, so we try to find a task that's independent from previous knowledge. So we did use a visual pattern. So the task was, and don't worry, I won't do that to you, but I could, just look at this pattern, try to memorize the black spots, and then after a few seconds it goes away, and then you have to recall where the spots are. And we do that a while, 5 times in that study. So we repeat, and then what you see is something very typical that you probably also know from your own research. You see these learning curves. People get better, people improve, and sorry for the French.
Sorry, you repeat the pattern?
Say again?
The pattern is always the same?
Yeah. In that study, we didn't change the pattern. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the learning. So here, that was always the same. And these are 3 learning curves. And the red curve is the younger participants. So there were roughly 600 participants, more or less. These are the young up to 40. This is 40 to 60, and this is 62 and older. And what you see is that they all learn. Younger, older adults, they all improve, almost triple their performance. You also see that the younger learn a bit more. The difference between the age groups actually increases, so the younger brain is more plastic. It does improve more. But even the older participants learn in a fashion that's relatively similar compared to the mid-adult range. And what for us was even more interesting is that when we look at the individual learning performance, so that's the difference between the last and the first trial, and model it against age, you see this, again, this huge cloud of points. So you see the general decline on average, but the amount of the general decline on average, when you look at that, is much smaller than the difference between the people of the same age bracket. So the 80-year-olds among each other are much more variable than the 20 on average compared to the 80. So that makes it, that's actually the interesting thing, is to explain this, not that. So why some 80-year-olds perform in a range that some 20-year-olds can only dream of. Don't look at anybody here. I may do the test at the end. No. So, and then you see the same in the other end. So this average lines mask a lot of the variance that's actually quite interesting. And
excuse me.
Yeah.
An obvious question.
Yeah.
The point is that you don't follow you have not followed the path of attention during the life.
no, that's cross-sectional data.
Probably those in the top are the same that were in the top.
Absolutely. No, we don't. This is cross-sectional data, that's for sure. But there are longitudinal studies that also suggest that some of these patterns do hold also for longitudinal studies. But this is obviously, it's a bit more tedious to follow people from 20 to 80 and let them do this for the rest of their life. But there are longitudinal studies. But you're perfectly right, this is a limitation of a lot of those data. So why is that important? So I showed you this graph that people are declining. But you could say, what the hell? I mean, who cares? Why is that important that I perform a bit? I can only detect 17 out of these black boxes, and I used to detect 24. Does that matter? It does matter as soon as people fall below a functional threshold. And that's when clinical psychologists get involved. And this is when dementia and clinical phenomenon get involved. So we do have a certain functional range where cognitive resources are not sufficient anymore to maintain an independent, autonomous life. So the question for us is rather, how can we model and how can we understand where people are, how they move, and when they fall below this threshold. And then from a more intervention perspective, obviously the key question is, can this be changed? Can we somehow make this curve not go that way, but go that way? And then if the person is lucky enough, he or she is dead before he or she drops below that threshold. So the third lesson, or the third research question that has been motivating a lot of our work is cognitive resources are, can, and should be trained at all ages. They are trainable. We know how to do that. And obviously, this should be done. The context of that line of research is something that we call, together with some other colleagues, cognitive reserve. The idea is that the neurobiological architecture of our cognitive system is not a matter of fate that just arrives like Deus ex machina at the beginning of old age, but it's been developed across the whole life course. It's obviously related to genetic factors, but a lot is related to what we do across our entire life with our brain. So that's where the subtitle comes from. Use it or lose it is really true for brain health, for cognitive health. So we see that education, for example, in young childhood age plays a major role for explaining how people are in terms of their cognitive functioning 80 years later. Whatever we do among our during our adult life, what you're doing here, so was basically what we do in our profession, what we do in different intellectual, more or less stimulating activities. Can be professional, but can be leisure activity, can be physical health. So the brain has been developed and has been exercised in a constant way that determines how we can cope with neuropathological damage in old age. And then, obviously, the question is how we can identify zones, how we can identify ages, how we can identify domains or methodologies to move those curves and keep them on a track, ideally staying over and above those functional impairment lines. And that's something that we call in psychology reserves, cognitive reserve in that case. And that's a major research focus of our team. And I will just present you one example for how we can do that experimentally. So one thing is, and that's even much more important than doing some specific tailor-made brain training, which also works, as I will show you. But much more important is how we go on with our brain across our entire life course. Perhaps just in parenthesis, and I think a still very impressive example is bilingualism. Who's bilingual in that room? Well, good for your brain. Because, I mean, the question is, are you truly bilingual? So did you learn the second language when you were a child? Like when you really were, like, do you speak, not just speaking well a different language, but really being bilingual? That, we know, turns our pure brain into a constant conflict management tool. Because if for individuals who have learned as infants a second language, we were raised bilingually, they basically have those two languages always constant active. And what the brain has to do is to down-regulate all the time the other language, and thereby use top-down control to suppress. What we usually do if we speak a language quite well, and when I moved to Geneva, I had to learn French when I was an adult, so adult learning is not that easy all the time. I had to experience myself. But now it works okay. I wouldn't call myself trilingual, but I mean, that's a lot of Swiss people are actually. So this is something when we can switch professionally between languages. But for proper bilinguals, the brain is using those capacities always at the same time, and then needs to train itself by down-regulating it. And when observing yourself, perhaps you have realized that when you get tired and this control doesn't really work that well, then words from the other languages, they sneak in those sentences, and then because this down-regulation doesn't work properly anymore when you're tired. So, but then another research line is more experimental, like how can we stimulate the brain almost like clinically intervention? What can we do to train the brain? And here the question that we have been asking in the last decade is what's the potential for plasticity across the lifespan? What are moderators, conditions? Why does it work better or worse in some instances, in some populations? Who profits most? What are the mechanisms? And what's the everyday transfer? Can we do that in a way that's useful for everyday life? And we focus on a domain that's called working memory. That's a subsection in the cognitive system that's there for conscious work with information. It's not just memory. It's an information that's been used, that's been worked with, that's been treated in a way that you have to use your previous knowledge to work with that information when you talk, when you read something, when you do mental calculations, stuff like that. And cognitive control, which is everything that's non-routine, that's non-habit. So when you have to inhibit things, when you have to switch between different tasks, when you do multitasking. The question is that this working memory is a central processing resource that is involved in almost all our higher order complex cognitive activities, in most everyday activities, and we do see substantial mean level decline. When you remember this graphic, working memory was one of those who was declining the most. So this is working memory, the gray ones here, where we see that is under pressure, which is a bit bad news when we know we need it all the time and it's important for our everyday functioning. So what can we do to make this go rise again? And here, just to give you an example from one of our studies where we designed some tasks to train that in an adaptive fashion over 3 weeks in that case. I won't go into experimental details. And we looked 9 months later whether this sustained their effects. So we did use some kind of visual spatial material. We used verbal material with mental calculation type of tasks, and we did use more cognitive control planning type of tasks. So the psychologists that will all know all these tasks. That is very traditional material that we turned into training material. Yes?
Sorry that I didn't pay attention, but what was working memory exactly again?
Working memory is the capacity that's at the center of your conscious information processing. So when you have to maintain and work with information. So when you have to do mental calculation, for example, it's not just maintaining information, but it's maintaining it consciously and working with it. Okay. So when we talk, then you basically have to remember how I started my phrase, and because I'm German, these phrases are very long, and then and in French it's even worse. And then you looking for the verb, and then so you have to use your previous knowledge, maintaining the information, and put it into context while the information is in your working memory. So that's the central processing unit that does all this integration.
Okay, thank you.
And the question we had together with others is whether we can train this, because it's a bit at the heart, it's the motor of our cognitive system. So the idea was a bit like, because we need that for a lot of things, mental calculation, reading, discussion, a lot of non-routine type of tasks. The question is if we can improve the functionality of the system. This may then make the system go faster in a lot of different contexts. So the question was, can we do that? And the short answer is yes, we can. And the good news is that also it does produce effects that are relatively stable. I mean, only 9 months follow-up, so always can look at this from a different time scale, but we can train that. The question is whether this then also transfers to everyday life. Do we then perform better in this type of tasks, or can we actually also change our cognitive system? There, the data are much more mixed, but we are still, I mean, there are two families, so to speak, in that research. Some are very skeptical, and some are a bit more optimistic. I'm a bit more of the optimistic guy. So we do see some transfer, and I'll just show you also a few other health-related tasks where we did that. So in an area where we do a lot of research, which is called prospective memory. Who has ever forgotten to buy a present for an important person, or attaching an email attachment to an email before sending it off, or buying something on the way home from work? This is when your prospective memory has failed you. So remembering to do something. So that, yeah, that's why I got fascinated, and that I'm still doing it, because my prospective memory is horrible. So without my electronic agenda, I would be hopelessly in trouble. But so how can we improve this everyday life relevant type of cognitive function? And here we did apply different training regimes, and to also make a long story short, so here we used an electronic blood pressure monitor as an ecological valid type of task. So we gave people this device and asked them to measure their blood pressure 2 or 3 times over a course of several days at home. And obviously the nice feature of that device is that it records when they did it, whether they did it in time or whether they forgot, or whether they told us, yeah, I did it, but they actually did. So did they improve this outcome when being trained? And they did. So we did apply different types of cognitive training regimes, and they did. And there are some strategies that you can also use to improve that. So there are training intervention ways of improving this type of real-world cognition. Another example, just to, it's also, sorry for the German here, where we did look at something similar in the context of nursing context. We did look at whether we can train these cognitive resources that I showed you at the beginning, were predictors in explaining workability and health. Can we train that in nurses in their real world when we train them? And we did apply a training regime, and we could show that this can train and this can be trained, and that can affect also their real world behavior. So that's a big program where we could show that it's a small effect, but it does also show up in everyday life. A current project where we actually look at something similar in a study that just got kicked off, so I don't have any data here. This is a study where we work with economists together and with computer scientists funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, where we look at another vulnerable population, and in that case, job seekers. And we know that people being unemployed, they're obviously having a lot of distress, they're losing motivation, but they're losing also cognitive capacity over not being active for a while. And then what we are currently doing with Raphael Lalive and Michele Pilizzari and Mauro Cherubini from the University of Lausanne and the University of Geneva, we look at diagnosing and training of those cognitive skills in the hope that we can help them reintegrating in the job market quicker, easier, with more confidence. So this is a multi-intervention randomized controlled trial where they get a lot of interventions, nudging them, but also cognitive training for their cognitive skills. And to give you an example of some of these training tools that we have developed together with a few colleagues that we work with in that area, some of the psychology amongst you may know this guy here, Gus Craig, one of the very well-known cognitive psychologist that has been in that area for a while. Peter Randall, a colleague from Melbourne, visiting me in Brisbane at that time, and Nate Rose, a colleague from the US, where we developed a training game. It's a bit of a serious game approach, where people play a game that's called Virtual Week, where they basically, we simulate this kind of task, buying a bread on the way home or buying a present. So they're playing kind of a board game scenario, and in that board game, we can integrate more or less important, difficult, variable things that they have to remember and strategies. So this is something we basically implement as a training game. So that this is the initial scenario. So they're kind of rolling the dice and going around, and when they cross event zones, then they have to go for an event. So every day of the week, you are asked to perform the following health tasks for the specified time. Take antibiotics at breakfast, and you see this Australian American background for breakfast, and dinner, and then do this and do this, and then whenever they come into the zone when they should have breakfast or dinner, then they have to do this. Or your appointments today, invite your friend David to dinner next week when you see David. So then they get this, and then across the course of the game, at some point they meet David in this scenario, and then they have to remember that they had to do this. And this we can make more complex, more difficult to detect, more difficult in terms of messages to be retained and stuff like that. So whenever, for example, here, now they basically get this card, so you have breakfast, you read your paper. For breakfast, do you have cereal, pancakes, bacon, eggs, or so, and then they basically have to play that game. It's a bit of a decision task. It has nothing to do really with that, but then they have to remember, oh yeah, now I'm at breakfast, I have to do this. And then they have to get these lists that we can hide or make more or less complex to reach, or more or less distractors, so we can play around with the difficulty level of remembering the task and the content. Well,
these tasks are all for the same day. I mean, so you ask them to do something on the same day or a few hours?
It can vary. I mean, we play the virtual week, so usually they play for a week, 7 days, and then there are daily tasks, there are tasks that repeat, there are tasks that are only once to kind of simulate. Obviously, that some is kind of that depends a bit on the time that you have.
But I mean, you focus more, say, on the short-term memory, the one that is a few hours, or?
I mean, in this training tool, we only have a few real hours. I mean, virtually, they're basically distributing that over a week. But in this tool, because this is kind of a brain training game, so to speak, which they play for half an hour per day or so. But the blood pressure type study that I showed you before, this is obviously a study that is really distributed across. That was across 2 weeks. And we are currently running a study where we use mobile phones and home-based sensors. So we basically have something put on their letterbox and see whether they forget to take out the mail and stuff like that. So this is distributed over 30 days, for example. And as you see here, this is just a few tests that we made, that we gave them to see whether this kind of intervention improves also their functioning under standardized conditions. And here you see that in 2 tasks, they actually did improve their performance also in every day. Okay, to summarize, I hope there are a few more, but 3 lessons, major lessons that we learned over the last couple of years. Cognitive resources are important for the aging individual, but also for the aging society. I gave you an example for the aging workforce, but obviously the whole health-related issues, neurodegenerative diseases is another example. That cognitive aging is individually very different, that we should not be too much focused on those big average lines, but that we should rather look at how people arrive at those different zones where they are in their age bracket. That cognitive reserve that you build up across your life may be an interesting mechanism, construct to help explain those differences between individuals. But to do so, that we need to look at the whole lifespan. So to understand aging, we need to start studying children. So that's our philosophy. So we cannot do gerontology without developmental psychology. And that, from an intervention perspective, we can and should train cognitive resources, and that we do so with a lab-to-light perspective, so that we go more into the real world of participants and try to connect our research that is based in the laboratory and using behavioral experiments or neuroscience, and try to predict what happens outside of the university laboratory in psychology. So cognitive stimulation training are probably the best prevention of cognitive decline from a public health perspective, and from a more organizational perspective, may be an interesting human resource instrument in the face of an aging workforce. That's it. I thank you.
Questions?
In this perspective, anyway, how much does attention, I'm not sure if you call it attention or interest to do something, because if I have to do something in the night that I really want to do, I will probably remember it, but it's something that I'm not interested in, I will probably forget it. How much important is the attention I have on those aspects?
Yeah, I mean, both is important, attention and importance. So attention is certainly, I mean, the phenomenon is called prospective memory, and when we observe ourselves, we experience this as a memory failure. I forgot to do this. But obviously attention as a cognitive process is an important point. So you need to have monitoring, we need to kind of detect the proper moment, we need to keep track of time, we need to pay attention to different stimuli. But also what you refer to, the attention in a sense of whether I believe a certain task is...
For me. For instance, if I want to do something tonight, I want to watch something, I will probably remember it.
Well, that's most of the time it's correct, but unfortunately not. So, I mean, this is a bit of an illusion that we are faced with a lot, that we believe that if it's important, we will remember, which is also, I will say, why I believe that's an illusion in a second, but it's also, on the other hand, an interesting phenomenon that failing on that task is usually being attributed to your personality, because in the service of your argument, people more or less often assume that if you forget, it wasn't important to you. So don't forget to bring your wife flowers on Mother's Day, but, because then you will, it's not probably your first reaction is that, oh, you have a bad memory, but I'm not important to you. So the point is that most of the time that's correct, because we invest more resources to tasks when we prioritize those tasks more than others. But there are unfortunate examples that it cannot be only importance. So you probably have all heard these stories that people have forgotten their children in their car, and it was hot, and they even died. I was involved when I was in the US for my PhD in a project where the people were looking at an incident with a pilot that landed the plane for a second time after having to go back and forgot to pull down the landing gear. So obviously that was probably very important for that person, but forgot still. So importance is not a guarantee that we do that, because there's a lot of distraction going on, and that it's the matter of how strategically we invest our resources, and that's more likely to happen when something is important. But there are a lot of processes going on that may still prevent these things.
In the graph on the declining capabilities with time, with
Yeah.
age, there were 3 capabilities that were constant or even increasing in time.
Yeah.
Can you tell something about
Yeah,
that?
that's everything that's related to knowledge, verbal abilities. In psychology, we call this crystallized intelligence. So this is something that's related to acquired abilities, so learned facts. So when we see, for example, when we give type of vocabulary tasks, we usually see that older adults are even better than younger adults. So everything that's related to world knowledge that's acquired, that remains relatively stable. Everything that's rather related to what we call fluid intelligence, so that's the functioning of the system, so that's the system in a way how it treats information, like processing speed or this working memory that I talked about, or like specific memory functions, that shows these declining patterns.
So as we know, human mind also includes more things than cognition, like emotions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do they also decline with age?
No, not all of these functions, obviously. I mean, there are differences between age groups. Things change, but there's good reason to assume that there are certain aspects of human information processing or like affective aspects that remain relatively stable or even improve. So there are some colleagues, some research that assume that emotional regulation does not change or even increases in efficiency. There's this, I would say, probably rather stereotype that older people are wiser, but there's little empirical research on wisdom. They at least show that probably it's not going to decline. I'm not so convinced that it's actually increasing with age, but there are obviously a lot of things that remain stable. Even in the cognitive system, I mean, you talked about this one curve that I showed, but there are other memory systems, for example. So there's all this memory that we call implicit memory, like how that we remember how to ride a bike or ski, so all this kind of procedural memory. They remain relatively unaffected with age. So there are specific resources that do decline, but others remain stable. And when you probably look at the grand average, I would say probably at least half of the functions remain relatively stable.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. But for me, the question is that these three main lessons that you presented there is something like a common sense. So my question is there any controversy in this community, in this kind of studies?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of, when I was in university, the plasticity of the human brain was very much under question for older adults. So and we now know a lot more is plastic, and we know that there's even neurogenesis in the adult hippocampus in very old adults. So this decline can be compensated and can be countered. That's certainly something that's under debate, and the question is how well these brain training interventions transfer. So there's a big some controversy for. So when you basically all have smartphones, and when you go to these app stores, whichever they may be, you can find dozens and dozens of brain training programs, but none of them is properly scientifically evaluated. So they probably don't harm except for costing money or your time, but there's no empirical evidence on which of those activities do actually benefit. And probably a lot of those who are marketed don't benefit at all. So there's a lot of open research going on there.
So I was indeed wondering about the generality of such studies, since, for instance, I know that there are some results claiming that experimental studies claiming that children who learn chess in the schools, this fact of learning chess does not help at all in improving in mathematics, for instance. And there are some, I think, pretty strong results in this sense, and music as well. So the problem here is that children actually improve to play chess. In some years, they studied chess, and they will improve in playing chess and something related to it. But the generality of this training does not hold. So, for instance, in these studies, could you address a generality figure of merit? Let's say.
Absolutely. And it's an important question. I mean, it goes a bit to the question now that your colleague asked.
That could be, if there are some tests to evaluate the cognitive resources of a person, why don't trying to map the results in this test comparing to cognitive trainings in some specific
Oh, that's exactly what we do. I mean, we do usually test what we call direct effects of the training, which is basically the foundation of going further. So do people improve in what they were trained? Do they follow the training? Do they improve in the training? But then we also test what we call near transfer, which is something that's related to that, but not exactly what they're trained. So playing chess and playing whatever type of other board game, and far transfer. Do they improve in mathematics or whatever? And that's what is done in all of those studies. And I totally agree. And that's an interesting point that goes back to the question. And due to that research, we now know better, not fully, but we now know better what's good. And playing chess, and I was in one of these typical old-fashioned traditional German high schools. So when I had 9 years of Latin, I mean, it was interesting, and I could read all of these Latin texts. But the idea of this kind of approach was that Latin basically has this kind of domain general effect. And we now know that learning Latin is good for learning Latin, and probably and that's fine. And transfers a little bit to other languages, so probably I had a bit of an advantage to study French when I knew the structure, but probably my French would have improved much better if I had learned French before in school and then. But we do know, for example, music is a totally different story. We have a study that we just finished where we can show that 2 years of instrumental musical orchestra type of intervention does improve broadly cognitive functioning of those individuals, not just
I
playing.
I knew some related words related with chess and music that were claiming the opposite.
Yeah, nice. I mean, that's there you have your debate.
But I guess specific of mathematics.
Yeah.
These studies I'm referring to the word study.
But that's exactly the design. That's the classical design of a proper randomized controlled trial in this type of research. That you have a training intervention, that you isolate certain components, that you have a control group that is more or less matched except for that component, and that you have a pre-post follow-up type of design with 3 steps, measuring the trained ability, measuring related ability, and measuring something domain independent.
There was an alternative approach has to do with the physical fitness. Physical well-being. How do you think there is evidence that supports
Absolutely.
the Menzani profession?
Absolutely. Now that's if I had to choose between cognitive training and physical training, I would say go for the physical training. So that's but that's not my expertise, so that's why I'm not selling that here, right? But there is good data that shows that physical, specifically cardiovascular fitness is very much related to cognitive health as well. So, and probably ideally both. But there are some studies that cross that. They have cognitive training, physical training combined. And there's very good evidence physical interventions do not just change your physical fitness, but also your cognitive health.
So my question is perfectly related to this previous one. You write that cognitive stimulation and training are the best prevention of cognitive decline. So what other techniques exist, and how have they been compared quantitatively?
Yeah. I mean, physical activity is one, but then there's this other more, I would say, domain general activities. So I would probably go for this, and you say, okay, what does train your brain? And being active in a lot of things. I mean, sleep is also good for your cognitive health, by the way, although it probably doesn't train your cognitive reserve. But doing music, doing social activities. So we have, and then it comes to the point on what you think is not cognitive activities. But we have a paper under review at the moment where we also look at internet use in older adults, which actually, by the way, only profits older men, not women. I don't know exactly why, but that's what we found. So then social activities. So we have a number of studies that show that social leisure activities are having an effect, or showing an effect, let's say, or showing an association. I mean, there's little evidence for really causal. So the studies that I showed you, they're really experimental designs with randomized group allocation. A lot of these other, a little bit more difficult to really test for causal effects. So the physical intervention is a different story. So here you can do proper randomized control type of designs. But everything that keeps the brain active and not just executing routine actions is good.
Related to this, when you have this spread of the population and you have this 80-year-old that are much better than the 20 years old, can you see anything in common of this population that they do that might be related? Or
well, that's exactly what we do here. I mean, that's our approach, that we kind of single out, let's say, extreme groups, and then you kind of statistically predict the probability of somebody being in one or the other subgroup by looking at different factors.
And which is a factor that you share about it?
Like education or whatever. So when I was in my PhD, we did a study on centenarians in Heidelberg, and there we found an interesting descriptive results first. So there wasn't this kind of typical normal distribution that you have like this two extreme low and high, and they have this nice kind of Gaussian distribution, but we had very bimodal distribution. There like 40% of the population, there was a population-based study, so we recruited all centenarians in and around Heidelberg, and if they were demented, and we interviewed their proxies, so 40% was perfectly independent, and 40% was more or less totally demented, and there were little in the middle, and then we really tried to predict who was in the good or the bad half of the distribution, so to speak. And there we found evidence, for example, that like every school year that they went to school when they were 8 or 9 or 10 predicted them being in the positive side of the distribution, increased it by, I forgot, like, I don't know, 75% or so. So really huge effects.
So this may be more important than genetical diversity?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have a serious answer to that, but genetic information is obviously one part of the puzzle, and in cognitive decline there are well-known risk factors like ApoE status, but we do know that lifestyle behavior is a very important, powerful, and then it comes to the debate, more or less powerful additional factor in explaining this huge variability.
So this stop here because we are getting to
Okay.
Okay, so thank you.